The Antifada is more than a podcast. It's a specter haunting the globe.
It is the synthesis of the two most frightening things for the cheerleaders of this reactionary hellworld.
One ravaged by the unbounded savagery of capital and its states.
Antifa super soldiers and Intifada.
Bash the fashion of global uprising.
Be prepared to enter
the Antifada mindset. We are broadcasting not live from Leftist Best headquarters, about a half-hour walk away from the gentrification-ravaged Gowanus Canal, in the coastal elite bubble of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. I'm Jamie Peck.
I'm Sean KB.
And we have a producer here, Andy. Say hello.
Hey, AP Andy here.
All right, and we are here with our guest, Natasha Lennard, who is awesome and is going to introduce herself a bit.
Hi, everyone. Yep, happy to be here. I'm Natasha Lennard. I am a writer living here in Brooklyn, obviously born in Britain. Right now, these days, my precarity involves being a columnist for The Intercept. I've written for The New York Times, The Nation, and my focus falls very much within the Left is Best framework.
Hell yeah.
Critiques of power from the left, and politics and philosophies of violence, which we're going to talk today.
We sure as
hell
hell
yeah.
are.
So we've known Natasha for a while, haven't we, babe?
Yeah, Natasha, I think we met around, Occupy Wall Street days?
Yeah, definitely. Got involved in some trouble back then altogether and have been friends ever since.
That's right. It's funny how large the left feels like in New York sometimes, when you're at a giant demonstration, but then it's really funny in this huge city how small it feels sometimes too. The fact that we run into each other all the time at these little events, it's maybe like a core group of, maybe 100 people that are our comrades and friends, but we've kept close over the years, which is great.
It is great. And there are these Venn diagrams, I think, of leftist groups and networks and friendships in the city, but I also think partly the sense of something being very large, there can be a little bit of a shock when you walk outside of a protest that seems massive, go a few blocks away, and the rest of the city is carrying on as normal. So that is our challenge of these times, to not overestimate ourselves, but not underestimate ourselves.
Yeah, totally. Well said. I'm very excited. We're going to be spending some time together on Fire Island next weekend.
Hell yeah,
sure
we're bougie.
I mean,
Hey.
We're champagne socialists, all right? We want this for everybody.
I'm pretty sure when we're on Fire Island, we're going to be oyster and Bloody Mary socialists. But
I'm a rosé socialist. Well, I'm actually a rosé anarchist in the summer. So, guys, get ready for that.
But in the
Nice.
in the winter, you become a gin and tonic tanky.
More of a whiskey hermit, I would say.
Ah, nice. Hermetism. That's a new left movement.
We have a question we like to ask all our guests here at the Antifada, and that question is, babe.
This one's a little different. A social and political institution, we're going to talk about violence today, that is completely untouched by any sorts of personal violence and things like, civil wars and beheadings and imprisonment and all that stuff. An institution that's not involved in structural violence like peasant expropriation, rentierism, and global imperialism. We want to ask you a question about just an average family. One like yours and mine, one that's always worked hard to make the world a kinder and gentler place, that has always cared about racial justice, political rights, social equality, whether at home in Great Britain or in the Americas, Africa, or India. So, Natasha, as you might have noticed this weekend, millions of people across the globe have had the pleasure to see, in all of its pomp and glory, and amid the swooning of the running dog ideological state apparatus of the bourgeois media, probably the most woke of all romantic unions. That of a sallow and callow ginger failson. I think his name is Prince Harvey of Tottenham, his name is. And I guess he has this American bride who's the first African-American royal, and the newly anointed princess. I believe her name's Meghan McArdle?
Yeah, yep.
Meghan McArdle. And I think that she's definitely going to use her new benign power as the sixth in line to become the hereditary CEO of Great Britain to immediately end mass incarceration, economic inequality, and structural violence against fellow POC in her birthland of the United States of America, which, by the way, totally didn't come into creation because we fought a goddamn revolution to throw those limey fucks of the British aristocracy out of the fucking colonies for goddamn fucking freedom, in large part so we didn't have to kowtow to some jumped up, inbred, parasitic fucking twats in this land of the fucking free and the home of the fucking brave, god damn it. So the question's, how about that royal wedding?
I too have really no strong feelings about the royal family.
No strong
much
feelings
like you,
here.
Sean. No strong feelings. Yeah, I mean, God, what that was a horror show. So obviously, growing up in England, I'm very much used to this, empty vessel of British nationalism that's covered in the pomp and ceremony and the pretense that just because there's no elected power that they're at the very worst superfluous. But obviously it's way worse than that. Like, this is a really, really dangerous human embodiment of like the keep calm and carry on colonial British spirit, which has always like enabled and perpetuated immense amounts of violence. And I grew up, I was about 9 or I think about 10 when Princess Diana died, and like that was just
the people's princess.
And it was just it was abject madness. You had people screeching and weeping on the street. And and every time there was the Queen's Jubilee or something like that, you'd have Union Jacks in the streets and crying grandmas. And I'm used to that shit. And I'm used to how awful that is and the pernicious fucking role that plays in, at the same time, austerity Britain is ripping apart the NHS. Brexit, obviously. And even before that, the kind of tendency towards smashing social welfare, the kind of brutality towards the working classes and young people of colour that inevitably led to the riotous outbursts of 2011 that were all too quickly swept away by the proper middle classes with brooms. And, the royal family very much is like, it is the symbol of that kind of process. And I'm used to that. I'm used to that shit. What is new and is all the worse is that you literally now have the guise and pretense that we've got feminism and anti-racism involved in that violence and that neo-colonial or endless line of colonial projects and power and inherited power. And
feminism though started with Thatcher, right, who was a very, very strong and really illustrious feminist figure, not only in Britain but all over the world as prime minister, right?
I mean, she just smashed
right
that glass. And it's all this funny thing when people talk about getting a woman on the money, getting a woman on the dollar. It's like, yeah, so powerful. I felt really empowered when I looked at Queen Elizabeth's face on my 20 quid note. That, my friends, that's true equality. So yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you guys saw all over the tweets and stuff that there was the head of the Episcopalian Church did a reading at the wedding, and he's a black pastor, and it was very like of that tradition, and people were really moved that in bloody Windsor Castle, you've got a guy referencing Martin Luther King and the idea of equality at the union of a woman who is a Hollywood actress for one, who went to private Catholic school, and a young boy who was born into unchallenged heritage of abject power, all the while the cash-strapped taxpayer is giving into a system that was willing to pay out £48 million for this absurd event.
Jesus Christ.
And smile and wave flags throughout it.
Holy shit, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's that much money. It was like the most expensive ever. Most of it going into security, which also speaks to how like fearful they are that someone might actually not like it. And obviously the same with the London Olympics and any sort of nationalistic performative nonsense. Security forces and the police cleared out homeless people on the procession route for months in advance. The other part of what happens that is not tweeted about within the joy of this, glorious feminist anti-racist wedding is that obviously police and security forces for the weeks running up to this procession, as was the same with the London Olympics, is the removal and ejection of homeless people from the area, lest there be a smudge and a smear of social realities during this abject, violent performance. But yeah, how about that dress there? She looked baby.
Honestly, this is going to sound really arrogant and craven, but my first thought upon seeing it was mine was better.
Yours was better.
Like,
you
really?
Way better
that's a 100,000-pound dress. Really, it's so boring.
It was
it's
boring.
Just plain.
I saw a disgusting headline.
A plain white dress.
I saw a gross headline today in the Times that said it wasn't a princess's dress; it was a people's dress. They
that's what I wear to
made
the
it more plain.
supermarket.
Yeah.
Then why was it so expensive?
Givenchy.
Where's my?
It was Givenchy.
It was a woman designer. So
it was like
there you go.
it was
Feminism.
It was like Zoolander, derelict.
Oh, man.
Anybody? Derelict my balls? Sorry.
I mean, all I could think of was like, God, I feel like our wedding was a lot more fun.
Yeah, no, it didn't look very fun. I wasn't jealous to not be invited.
No,
There's
it
probably
really
no
wasn't.
Satan at the real wedding.
No Satan or Satan. Also, also to speak to like the hashtag resistance, right? Lauren Duca, and I mean her no ill, perfectly sweet girl. I
Bless her
presume.
heart.
Bless her liberal heart. She tweeted something out like, "Take that, Donald Trump."
What?
The real
What?
royal wedding, and showed the kind of fullness of the procession route and how many people were there compared
Oh,
to the
yeah.
really empty.
I saw that. That was Laura
inauguration.
Duca?
Yeah, and I'm like, oh yes, great, sweetie. Hashtag resistance. The royal wedding with a woman of color got more attendees than Trump's inauguration. The revolution is nigh. So yeah, I think that really kind of epitomizes my issue with this royal wedding.
Well,
That's some pretty strong opinions. I
That,
wasn't expecting that from my intro question.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be more gentle. Your response.
that's a very good segue, though, into our next question, which we like to ask all of our guests here at the Antifada.
the real question, actually.
So this is the real question, and that is, Natasha, how pure is your hate today?
Oh, how pure can hate be with a mild hangover? I mean, it can depend. I would say we're on a 70% today, but
That's not bad.
I
Not
mean,
bad.
I think that's to do with slightly C.
It's a solid C. It's a solid C mark.
It passes.
Guys,
It's
great
good enough for
inflation.
us.
Great inflation.
Okay, fine. You'll get a gentleman's B, gentlewoman's B for that.
Yeah, totally. So, I thought we would start our serious discussion by letting you introduce your book a little bit.
There's a book coming out that
What?
you are writing yourself.
Me with others, actually. So this book.
You're so humble.
So no, but it's true. A book is coming out with the lovely City Lights publishers in August, and it's called Violence: Humans in Dark Times. And
We're feeling that.
Violence, capital V. And actually, it isn't just my book. It's co-authored with a political philosopher, also from England, called he's actually from Wales.
Ooh, you just lost our whole Wales audience.
Sorry.
Welsh nationalists everywhere are just going to start boycotting the show. Sorry, go.
Sorry, you guys are going to get a sweep of angry letters for that one.
Yeah, well, now we've arrived when we're also getting angry tweets from Donut Twitter calling you a racist. 'Cause you don't
We'll
support
get there.
the royal wedding.
We'll get there because we're at 130 patrons, so only 53 more, and Acid Kitchen comes out.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe the next big reward could be we get to the point where we'll try to competitively offend all indigenous groups within a larger political. We start with the Welsh, and then maybe
all Commonwealth and all Commonwealth countries.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll start with the Welsh and work our way up.
Canada,
got it.
definitely
Oof,
Canada.
they're
Sorry,
up for it.
Canadians.
You can do an acid kitchen with some disgusting Welsh food.
Ooh.
Ooh, it's probably
challenge.
It's so disgusting. I don't even know what Welsh food is.
Nor
but
do I.
I guess we'll find out.
So anyway, lovely Brad Evans, who is my co-author, and I have this book coming out, which is, it's the format is it's a series of extended discussions, interviews with numerous philosophers, thinkers, and artists on the different ways of conceiving and thinking about violence. So it's pretty broad reaching. So it's not my book as such, and it began actually as a series at the New York Times is Stone blog, little red philosophy section.
Yeah,
at
actually,
the
the Stone was the first place that in all the years that I believe Noam Chomsky made it into the pages of the New York Times. Is that right?
I didn't know that. Possibly. I mean, I would have thought his very average leftivism had been included more broadly.
I mean, they haven't even discovered Bernie yet. Like, they don't know about Noam Chomsky.
I mean, Simon Critchley started the Stone, and I would say he's further, but it's the Stone. No one reads it. I love it. No one reads it. And it was a series about the idea of violence, and we spoke to various people. So who's included in it? I mean, the late great Zygmunt Bauman. I spoke to friend of the New York left family, Nicholas Mertzoff, who's a professor of visual culture, about the spectacle and framing of violence in protest. I spoke to Moira Weigel about the idea of love and modes of patriarchal violence performed by the idea of love. I spoke to an excellent philosopher called Adrian Parr about climate degradation as a form of violence against humanity. But I think it's a nice compendium, and I think it's worth having all together as book form. And it's broken up into these pretty readable discussions. So it's a great if you wanted to pop it by your loo. Like, it's a great, like, poop size. Each
Nice.
each discussion.
Each
seems,
chapter is like a shiny turd.
like it'll just exactly that we timed it that way.
The future of paper books, people.
And then when you're done with it, you don't have to buy more paper for the loo.
Exactly. We will not mind if it's a dual-purpose dead tree object. So that was fun to make, and the book is sort of a culmination of that.
And when's it coming out?
It's coming out in August, probably to little fanfare, small publishers. But, I'm excited to have it out. But it's definitely not my, it's not like my first book offering. It's a compendium of stuff that looks broadly at violence, which I try and look at every time there are stories about social justice struggle and protest, to try and look at the role violence plays in those and the way it's framed.
Cool. I think that's a very good lens with which to look at the world, especially at this current moment in time. I think a lot of what gets lost in a lot of these conversations, whether it's about Antifa protesters or Black Lives Matter or what have you, is the violence of the status quo, right? The violence of capitalism. And
its state, too.
And yes, capital and its states. So on that note, I would like to kick things off with a bit of sound. You've probably heard this speech before, but I'm going to play it for you again because it's great. It's Angela Davis talking about violence.
You asked me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small. I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. What it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
I think that is, usually the recurring theme I try and go back to, and I think one that, is tragically and perniciously overlooked in most standard news, New York Times style narratives about an event like Ferguson, about an event like Baltimore, and it's a liberal and conservative tendency to either willfully or unwittingly mislocate violence. And we see this turn of phrase all the time when we read about protests that have, for example, protests that are riotous in form, that maybe include property damage or clashes with police or clashes with neo-Nazis. And the standard phrase is, the protest or the protesters turned violent. And I really think this violent turn needs more interrogation, because what it presumes and allows for is this myth that, those of us that have the privilege to maybe be protected from this in our daily lives, that we're living in a baseline of peace, such that the demand for peace, the demand for non-violence in these moments is even possible or desirable, because there is no background of non-violence. There is pre-existing violence anytime, in a world in which we need to still assert that Black Lives Matter, in a world that there are neo-Nazis gathering easily and publicly and shouting blood and soil, the background state is violence. So if there is, a counter-violent reaction, it needs to be understood in that framework as a counter-violence. To ask for peace. Bernard Williams, the philosopher, has a phrase that I think about often, which is, to ask for peace when there is no peace is to say nothing.
Particular issue of protest, and as you said, this idea that they're turning violence. It's almost always the protesters who are blamed for that in this one-sided way, right? When how many protests have we been to, or how many episodes have we seen across the country and across the world where it's essentially the forces of the state, the police, that begin the violence, right? People are assembling, as supposedly is our right to do. They have a grievance and they're together, and a line of riot police show up, looking like basically, I don't know, non-Antifa super soldiers, and push into the crowd, and they pop things off. And I'm not saying that violence against property, is something that I condemn at all, because I think in certain cases it's completely justifiable. But I think that this one-sided concept that it's always the protesters that turn violence just completely elides the reality that it's a standoff often between armed police on the one hand and peaceful protesters on the other.
And I think that's the issue. So, so often it's the state and the armed wings of the state that are the agitators on the scene. In fact, they push, they grab, they assault. But even if they don't, right? Or even if we're talking not in the case of armed police, if we're talking about a Richard Spencer talk or rally, and there isn't physical agitation coming from the police or the neo-Nazis and the fascists, even if I still say that context is violent. And it's not the counter-protesters who bring the violence, not the protesters or the rioters or the looters who bring the violence. And I think it's, we can't begin sensible discussions about tactics of confrontation and tactics of property damage until we correctly locate the undergirding state of violence. All conversations misframed and do that from the jump.
Yeah, it just seems like another way in which the sort of ruling class, the status quo, capital in its states, whatever you want to call it, often tries to make the victims look like the oppressors and vice versa. And I thought about that a lot when I read about the horrible violence in Gaza past week as well. And I know that is, it's not exclusive to Israel, but I know that is like one of the cornerstones of Hasbara, is to constantly make the oppressor state, the settler colonial state, which is Israel, look like the victim in some way.
That fucking op-ed in the New York Times by, what was his name? Shmuel
Rosner.
Shmuel Rosner was just absolutely despicable. I don't have words for it. I don't want to read from it. I hate even referencing the fucking
Guys, don't
thing.
Google it. Don't Google it.
Yeah,
don't read it.
It's just absolutely disgusting, the dehumanization of oppressed peoples.
Yeah, and it's crazy that the paper of record would admit that kind of violent ideology into what it considers to be like the mainstream acceptable range of opinions. Like, can you imagine them doing that about, I mean, I guess I should probably look up my history. Perhaps they did, but like, would they do that about apartheid South Africa?
I mean, I'm sure they probably did, to be honest. And, the New York Times has a unbroken and storied record of unquestioned support for Israel and its violences. I mean, even that was a lot of the focus of Chomsky, who, again, is really not my political, but he did, really focus on that in Manufacturing Consent and the way in which the oppression of Palestinians was glossed over and normalized in the pages of the New York Times. And in certain sites in that paper, it's got a little better. Like the Palestinian struggle has been given some space. But keep in mind, the baseline is complete apology for Israel. And, this goes before that vile Rosner column. I mean, you've got Barry Weiss.
Oh, God.
Who is, like, literally the stupidest woman
We have-
in the world.
Oh,
And she's
we
my enemy.
dragged the shit
I
out of her
had
already.
We did a
so
whole
much
episode based
She was
around her.
on. She was on Bill Maher again, I think, last week.
And it was awful.
Definitely fucking. Just
We
saying,
called
call
it.
back. They're fucking.
You
It's
heard it here
disgusting.
first, folks.
Go back and listen to episode 2 with my description of what that looks like. If you want to not be able to eat for another week.
Yeah, and they were blaming the Palestinians, and in terms of like locuses of violence and narratives of violence, and I teach a class about critical journalism at the New School, and I always use like New York Times little headlines examples, and the Gaza massacre recently was a perfect one, and like this was tweeted a lot when the New York Times had as their paper headline on page A1. 53 Gazans died. And then everyone was like, oh, and you see this all the time with police violence in the US, right?
Yes.
The very term officer involved, the like passive voice. And the violence is perpetuated by the passive voice, really speak to how the status quo wants to uphold a notion of aggressor.
Yeah, and these people are such nerds about active voice versus passive voice that they must have a really good reason if they're using it.
Well, I wanted to broaden this a bit. Well, we can stay on Gaza, but I think the point you make about Israel can just be generalized when it comes to the Times and the elite capitalist
mainstream
media.
media.
Yeah,
in
the
general.
Post and everything.
Because if you looked at the run up to the Iraq War, it was a very, very similar thing. They took the government line that drew them up to the war with Judith Miller and everything. Certainly when the United States backs like overthrowing the regime in Venezuela or any sort of U.S. government action, the New York Times, as the elite paper of record, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Iraq or Libya or wherever, almost always in its op-eds and also in its reportage, does take the state line on these things. So if Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States, you can see that horrific Thomas Friedman article where he sat down with the new prince, who's jailing people, and continuing that disgusting Yemeni war that Saudi Arabia is waging on the people down there. But Tom Friedman can sit there and laud him for being a reformer, for opening up the country, because in the New York Times and in the government and in the media, these people are our friends and our allies. And there's no greater ally, as they always say, to the United States and vice versa than Israel.
As an institution, always, they cover themselves by being like, well, he's a columnist, and that's him, as if their sort of standard issue coverage wasn't playing the same game, if less explicitly. But if you want to look at the kind of discursive universe covered by like the Post and the Times, aside from the occasional throw-in op-ed by someone great like Sarah Lennard, great socialist ally, and AP Andy here, who's had a great op-ed at
Hell yeah.
Sure did.
But
listening.
aside from those very few one-offs, anomalies, the discursive universe of the Times can be shown by the spread it has on its op-ed roster, where the furthest person to the left is Charles Blow, who would not count as a leftist or abject liberal Michelle Goldberg, and then to the right we obviously have Bret Stephens, Barry Weiss, and that's like soup. And what that gets to do is allows liberals to keep framing themselves as the left, which silences the left and upholds different narratives of violence, as we're talking about in the way protests and conflicts.
I've tried to explain to some liberal friends of mine who are sort of constantly disappointed in the quote-unquote liberal media or in elected Democrats that they're not actually being that liberal. That I try to explain it in a way that's not like I'm a snotty anarchist, haha, but like these institutions represent the left wing of neoliberalism.
That's right.
And the reason they have people like Barry Weiss is it's this sort of honest attempt to show the other side, what they consider to be the other side of the issue. But, it's still caught within certain parameters. They're not going to have anyone who challenges neoliberalism in any real way from either the left or the right. Mm-hmm. So you can have this acceptable range of ideas from, these sort of liberal, coastal elite Hillary supporter people to, on the other end, sort of this Barry Weiss. She actually is like quite a bit more radical than I would expect.
Like radically
reactionary
than
I would expect the Times to hire. But she's still like when she says that identity politics are bad for the discourse, she's partly right. She's just also part of the problem, right? Because we have sort of these left neoliberal identity politics, which is like diversity capitalism, and these right neoliberal identity politics, which is like, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchy capitalism. And, there's certainly some very crucial differences between those two things, but neither of them challenges the neoliberal world order in any substantial way.
Right. And I'm not going to look to the New York Times for that, and never will. But I think when we're trying to see how certain discourses of what's acceptable to speak of, and how we talk about the oppressed, oppressor, and where we locate violence in the world, that's what you're going to get from the mainstream, and that has a huge impact in how we talk about these things and what we need.
I wanted to ask a question to our guest about the left's digestion in Gaza. I noticed that a lot of the ways that people are talking about it are purely based on portraying Palestinians as victims. And then, of course, you have Zionists responding, well, they had arson kites and
with swastikas on them.
Baby bombers and such. And I think the problem with that kind of dynamic is you just have to make it pure Gandhian non-violent army that are just willing to be massacred versus, the oppressive force, which even if that were the case is kind of a disgusting thing to want. And I think it's getting closer and closer to the reality as, you have thousands and thousands of Gazan people realizing that they will likely die, but still going on this march of return.
You describe it perfectly, and I think it's certainly not restricted to this particular conflict. And it's very much the good protester, bad protester, old canard. And I think often it comes from a well-meaning place, a well-meaning, quite liberal place of wanting to salvage and defend the oppressed actors in the narrative. So, in Black Lives Matter protests that had riotous elements, you would have a reactionary condemnation of the violence. And then you would have a kind of liberal response that was no, look, many people were just marching. Many people didn't break any windows. And, with this situation in Gaza, no, these were journalists. These were unarmed protesters. This desire to have a perfect set of oppressed people that it repeats a really problematic thing, because then the move then is to try and isolate the bad forces and the baddies, and that obviously gives ground for more oppression against those aspects of it.
Yeah, the people who were breaking property maybe did deserve to get shot or whatever. And we kind of respectability politics.
And we never want to enter into that. And I think specifically in the case of Gaza, what that does is uphold a narrative that says that Gazans have no right and no grounds from which to actually fight back. And there was actually an interesting John Schwartz article in The Intercept, plugging where I write,
Go ahead.
last week.
Glenn Greenwald, friend of the show.
Sure. Yep. But highlighted that Israel in the past, with the case of Egypt and the Six-Day War, used and explicitly noted it a grounds for attack, a grounds for military intervention, the fact of a blockade. And I think the sentence, although this would be not particularly word for word, but I remember it being something like, a blockade and peace cannot coexist. So yet that specific logic, which is then denied for Gazans who are not only blockaded, but are denied the ability to live, was the precise military logic that Israel used to invade Egypt at that moment. So it's a fascinating illogic, but it's logical in terms of maintaining a system of power.
Yeah, systems of power. I want to kind of bring it back to the structural elements, which I think in a lot of the liberal media, even the conservative media, right, you have this kind of set piece battle between these Gazans trying to march on the fence, and then you have the IDF sniping and shooting them and tear gassing them, when a lot of the times, again, the media, and I think a lot of people on the right and the left, do not want to go and look at the structural reasons why these things are happening. I don't think it's funny, haha, but if you look again at that Times op-ed, which we will not read, the author is writing a lot about the sanctity of borders, right? And that's what states are, right? They have a geographic border, right, under which they have control. Tell that to the people living in the occupied West Bank right now about the sanctity of borders, right? Israel needs to protect its borders. Well, how about all the settlements happening in the West Bank? I guess borders aren't that important, 70 miles away from there. But to get to the larger... No, go ahead.
And just to paint a picture for those who don't know, Like, it's not like Israel is being invaded from some outside threat,
Right.
from outside of its borders. Like, Gaza is an open-air prison, completely contained within a hostile settler colonial state. And that's where a lot of Palestinians were internally displaced to after they were forcibly removed from their homes.
As we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel, that means that a Palestinian in Gaza who's maybe 71 years old or older could have potentially been crossing that border and wanting to go back to a place that they remember growing up as kids. You know, that was the mandate of Palestine. So it's things, again, when you look at it structurally, and this is very much tied to the sense of violence, right? If you see what's happening with the blockade and the siege of Gaza, you see a quote-unquote peace process that there's absolutely no hope for whatsoever. Neither actor seems prepared to even sit at the table with that. Gazans are impoverished. Gazans are facing IDF violence day in and day out. And Gazans are hopeless. And like Andy said, this is why the context under which you could see thousands of people, running up again within under gunfire, right, in order to basically do the only thing possible they can think to try to protest these activities. What violence does in a structural sense, and this is the siege of Gaza I'm talking about here, is it also basically, it structurally determines the way that those oppressed people within that area are going to react. So if you have this massive IDF and Israeli violence and blockade, you now have a group that is equally violent in rhetoric, if not in action, which is Hamas. And Hamas, is not an ideal national liberation organization. It was, in fact, one that, if you look back, was actually helped. It was helped to be started and created by the Israeli state because it was an actor that they thought they could deal with as an Islamic fundamentalist group. But Hamas has taken this role now as the official power within this little Gazan statelet. And let's not make the mistake on the left that a lot of people make too, to say that just because there's structural violence, right, and these people are trying to attack their oppressors or get out from under oppression, that every way that they express that oppression and try to fight against it is a positive one and one that we should be quote unquote supporting.
Right, and I mean, and that is a problem with, oversimplification of international solidarity sometimes. None of us should have any love for Hamas, and to understand that Hamas would not have the control that they have were it not for the blockade is not to legitimize them in the same way the IRA and Sinn Féin obviously garnered control and forces and support in Ireland and Northern Ireland, but that doesn't mean setting off nail bombs in London aimed at civilians, mass civilian populations, when I was a kid was valid just because the Irish struggle is profoundly valid and was in response to British forces occupying much of Belfast and making life violently impossible. We have the luxury and therefore the obligation of nuance. And just to talk a little bit about, as you were saying, the willingness of, the willingness of just Gazan civilians to put their bodies in line for sacrifice is that, that really speaks to the extremities we're talking about, which would also explain having to lean on and turn to an extreme and pernicious leadership. And I think...
And one that, sorry to interrupt, but real quick, and one that, just like the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, has utter domination, over those folks. Hamas itself, unlike the Palestinian Authority, which uses, just a normal, nice, organized police force to do its violence, Hamas, if you're a Palestinian, if you're in Gaza, just a regular everyday person, and you don't like what Hamas is doing and you want to go out and protest, they are going to kill you, or they are going to throw you in a prison cell, and they're going to torture you.
Yeah, one of many
people,
lies
folks.
set forth by the American Zionist media establishment is that Hamas has the support of the majority of Palestinians.
They won't allow elections.
And that is not
years.
true.
And it's the idea of support and then devastation and necessity, and the necessity that perhaps made people feel they would be the right choice after 2006. And I think to talk about, I don't know if you guys remember, but it was truly appalling. I think it was 2014 during the
Operation Cast Lead.
Exactly. Was it that one or the one before? Yeah, I think it was Operation Cast Lead in response to this, which, we got a lot of images. We got a lot of the spectacle of it made it to the US media and to our social media timelines. And Netanyahu at the time condemned Hamas for bringing out their, and I quote, telegenic dead. And
Jesus.
It's this, because there were pictures of children who had been bombed, being carried in their funerals and being held by their weeping parents. And let's not forget that if there are the telegenic dead, it's because Israel is bombing children until children are telegenic. And Glenn Greenwald actually pointed out at the time that horrifyingly Netanyahu's words echoed those of Goebbels, who claimed the Jews would pull out their pitiable dead for the world to see. And I think it is interesting to think about spectacles of violence and which sort of bodies in the world are able to induce sympathy and support, and in what form. So you don't need to see a lot of images of certain people, and you don't see them in the media to presume you support them. But it seems with oppressed brown bodies, we need to almost see them ripped apart, dead, and lying in the street or in their parents' weeping arms for their humanity to be realized. And I think that's this profound double standard of that you see within the way violence is spectacularized. And then the story of that, links back to Emmett Till's mother wanting his, destroyed face to be visible in an open casket. So I think thinking about that sort of gross and grim process wherein Gazans also rely on the fact of their own visible dead to get any sort of global solidarity and sympathy, and to get they only get humanity. I think that's really tragic.
Yeah.
I think in a similar light, and bringing things a little close to home as we keep talking about violence, I think all of us here have been to Black Lives Matter protests here in New York City, and I'm sure that our listeners have been to them elsewhere. One of the things, and it's been very powerful, but also obviously very sad, but in a sense galvanizing, that you saw at those protests were folks chanting out the names of the dead. And of course, as that movement progressed and became more in the public awareness, that list of dead grew and grew and grew. So you talked about legitimate forms of violence, right? And you talked about the spectacle. We have, in a sense, our own instance of that in the United States, now that the carceral state and the over-policing of black communities has been in the national headlines. I think one question I would ask you is, how does the everyday structural violence of the state, in terms of surplus populations, in terms of people of color, how do we interrogate that sort of violence on a structural or philosophical level?
Well, I think, and part of the ways these violent structures work, incarceration particularly is to make something invisible, right, for the rest of us. So, that is part of the reason, the kind of removal of a group of, unwanted by the state people, aside from it being an industrial complex. I think the ability to react to it and keep it in our psyches, in our struggle, and in something we focus on is that, it's difficult. And you think about, Rikers is its own island, and then you think about state prisons. They're in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. Like, you want to go up to 5 points, take a 5-hour drive, go through some tumbleweed. And these are the sort of maximum security prisons where, there are entire towns in the middle of nowhere, which not only makes it hard for loved ones to connect, it makes us hard for us to organize around in situ. So I think that's a process of structural violence through disappearance. And then, and all kinds of different segregations enable that. So, the way gentrification works and the way different communities have different access to centers of town and the way communities are segregated and policed, that mean that, for something to be visible such that it could provoke outrage and be understood often takes quite a lot of extremity. And you think about Mike Brown's body lying for hours in the street until someone puts a sheet over it. Do I think that was a huge aspect in triggering a revolt? Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because I know we're seeing more and more documentation of this kind of violence against especially black people in this country. And we've seen a lot of horrible videos in just the past year or so of people basically being executed by the police.
God, that guy in Sacramento was only 6 weeks ago.
We've seen, we've all seen them. They're fucking awful. And, the movement to humanize these victims of police violence, say their names, etc. Do you think this documentation is going to have an impact on the status quo?
It's really complicated because, I mean, often at the end of the day, to spread and share this documentation, which I do think it's profoundly necessary but not sufficient. Nick Mertzoff, I think, who's I mentioned earlier, professor of visual culture at NYU, I think he makes a really good point around the difference between looking and sort of persistent looking. He talks about persistence in this. It's all too easy with the kind of unending flow of imagery, spectacle, a lot of which deals with horror and death. If you are looking at a Twitter news cycle, be it about a school shooting or, just the latest police execution, it's very easy to normalize and not be moved by. And that's a problem of saturation. It's a problem of how often these things happen.
And a deeply violent culture in general.
Right. So, these aren't sufficient to provoke more than a kind of collectivist share and shared outrage, which doesn't always lead to necessary rage and change. But I think to think about like persistent looking and not just glossing is important. But, again, none of these are all part of constellations of how we read and internalize and normalize our world. So, of course, they're not going to be sufficient. And at the same time, they spread the fact of something and make us alert. They also can just form part of a normalized background through our lives, which we often do. I mean, I do.
Yeah. I mean, I think most of us who live in New York especially have the experience of like something terrible could happen at any point in time and you just can't think about it because otherwise we would be totally paralyzed and unable to go about our lives.
And I think all the time in which the things I normalize that if I step back I really shouldn't, like the way in which I can see someone sort of screaming, yelling, obviously kind of a destitute poor person, appalling smelling, and if I'm in a hurry, I rush past. Mm-hmm. And this is a absolutely common experience in New York, and I hate what I do, and but it does, the fact of seeing it doesn't change.
Sure. Yeah. So just to broaden it out a bit, I know I've seen a lot of liberal coverage of these kinds of police killings, and a lot of liberals are very concerned about it, I think, in very good faith. But I think their analysis sometimes leaves something to be desired in terms of the way they frame it, like, we just need to kick racists off the police force, or we need to have better punishment for racist police murderers, or, better body cameras, reforms in how policing is conducted, etc. And they don't really draw the connection between white supremacy and capitalism in any kind of way. I just want to know your thoughts on that and how you would situate this violence is part of a larger system.
Right, I think, and, that certainly is what we've seen in the way that, Obama was very much praised for taking seriously the fact of racist police violence in the form of demanding reform, certain things about certain acts passed about demilitarizing police forces, making it harder for police to get former military weapons. And, liberals were really happy with that. And now we're in a difficult point when you've got Trump rolling back on those things. So the things you're trying to even fight for from the baseline were really like limited, moderate, not particularly impactful reforms. We've seen the fact that body cams have really not stopped this sort of consistent police violence.
Now we just get better videos of people being killed.
Right. And
people getting killed.
Exactly. So we've got, more transparency. So they're more transparent that their racist impunity will not end. Right. So I think, that to explain to as many people as possible and for them to really get their heads around it and agree that policing is violent. And especially in the history of the United States, policing is racist violence. The origin in slave patrols, the fact of, the through line from like Jim Crow to mass incarceration and police's central role in that. And the fact that police as uniform has always been uniformly symbolic of an authority that upholds a white supremacist status quo that undergirds this country. So, if you say to a liberal, I'm an abolitionist, I think we need to find work towards a world without policing and without prisons, they often look at you like you're a nutbag.
And to add to that, the black working class in this country is obviously a particular with its own experience, but also part of the larger working class that's existed in this country. All those examples you mentioned are, of course, correct. And what you see with the professionalized police forces that come in the late 19th century, too, especially in urban areas, was a real fear of the mob, right, of the dangerous classes. And who are those? Those were the working class people, whether black, white, immigrant, who were trying to organize, who were trying to form unions. And these police forces, of course, were the first ones to jump in and break up those picket lines. Whether it was black folks fighting for civil rights, or whether it was workers trying to organize, or women doing street protests, whatever the case may be, the police are also at the front line of maintaining capitalist order.
Right, and then it's difficult to explain to people when they say, well, what if we had more women and more black people on the police force? Would that not create an environment of greater empathy and greater communal engagement?
Yeah,
and
like
I wouldn't
community
say,
policing.
Right, and I wouldn't say no, it would make no difference at all. But when the anarchist slogan, which is not limited to anarchists at all, like ACAB, all cops are bastards. The aim of that slogan is not to say every single individual person who, for whatever economic needs of their family and whatever culture they grew up in, become a policeman is a bastard. It's the way the violence of the uniform and the role it plays, structurally violent one.
Social order and protection of private property.
Exactly.
Yeah, say more about that. And that's really important.
And so, it has a function in society to defend the existing order, which is instantiated through private property, and who has it, who hasn't. And that's what the police remain in service of, which has absolutely nothing to do with, a working class guy from Staten Island thinking, I want to be a cop, I want to be a good guy. So I think it's a big stretch to try and explain the structural violence of the police to people that haven't had to experience it in everyday life. It's obviously not a shock to people that live with the violence of police stop and frisk. The fact of one of the, I think, important takeaways that people learn in Ferguson is, people ask why are there so many police stops, and the way the ticketing system that is usually aimed at black civilians, stopping people in cars, actually fills city council coffers. It's how it's how these governments run. Jackie Wang, in her recent book Carceral Capitalism, does a really, really good job of just not just talking about the structural violence in communities of existing police forces, but and not just the prison industrial complex and how capital runs through that, but really talking about how local governmental organization and funding came to depend through a debt structure on policing and the money garnered from policing civilians and demanding ticketing and violation tickets and things like that, and how that crept into standard American life. And that doesn't always present itself as an executed guy caught on video with cops handcuffing his corpse. These are the modes of everyday life that keep people down, and people unable to organize and unable to live and feed themselves, but keep the status quo of capital and state that upholds it running.
I'd just like to, as I always do, add a little historical note on that. I think if you look at the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s, so politicians, of course, you'd have Reagan, you'd have the first George Bush, and then you'd have our good liberal progressive Bill Clinton. You saw a real ratcheting up of policing, but also a huge change in the way that policing was implemented. And as I always like to do, I would tie that, I think, to the changes that are happening in political economy in the United States. So in these urban areas, and New York is, of course, kind of almost like the archetype for this. You had an industrial sector, that pulled a lot of folks, working class people. As the 60s and 70s went on, a lot of working class people of color into the city for these relatively good paying union jobs, right? You saw this in Detroit and LA and elsewhere. And then as the economy goes into crisis and things shift over into what we now would term neoliberalism as a phase of capitalism, all of a sudden a lot of those good manufacturing jobs started to go elsewhere. So now you had a situation where capital is disinvesting from the city, real estate capital is disinvesting from the city. You have a process where the entire sense of what the city is supposed to produce goes from things, actual commodities, into things like services and the financial sector. And that process takes, 25, 30 years to pan out until we're in this uber gentrified hellscape of New York City where, there's cops on every corner, but the violence isn't there anymore in many, many cases. New York and a lot of other cities have very low rates of violence compared to 30 years ago. And the way I try to understand that is, again, structurally. And I think a lot of what we're dancing around is how difficult it is in order to understand things from a structural left perspective, because it's very easy to say black people are bad and commit crimes. That's why the good cops have to come in and arrest them. The right-wing argument, right? But the more difficult argument to make is that in the 1970s, there was essentially created a surplus population in these urban areas, a population that was not needed by capital. It was not needed by the state in order to get votes or in order to produce. And so you essentially had a whole bunch of people who had no other means to make a living. And it's no accident, I think, that the carceral state law and order arises at this point in time in order to clamp down on these people. And in many cases, for millions and millions of people, arrest them and throw them into prison as a form of social control. The dangerous classes.
Yeah, completely. And social control, and a way in which, flows of capital can continue. You start seeing more and more ticketing. You start seeing, it is certainly like a big part of the violent constellation that remains the war on drugs.
That's right.
Like you can create value by arresting.
Yeah, and I don't want to let these people off the hook too much, like Reagan, Clinton, etc. Like, surely they were pretty bad people driven by some pretty bad ideology.
Jamie would have voted for Reagan. She told me.
It also, Ronald Reagan did nothing wrong. No, it also speaks to the structural limitations of bourgeois politics, right? Just like with the police, it's not necessarily that all of these police are bad people on an individual basis, although maybe they are. That's structurally what they're put there to do, and
it's ultimately it's insignificant if they're good or bad people.
Yeah, right. And what happens within this structure is largely determined by these underlying economic forces, which we as humans created, but are now completely controlled by. Like we talked about in the last episode, the shift from this sort of old school learning style of universities to this more neoliberal market-focused one. Like, this is how it happens. It happens due to the vicissitudes of the market. And I think a lot of the time, this is why leftists and liberals are talking past each other when we talk about these things, because we talk a lot about materialism to the point that people are sick of it. But it really is, like, everything makes so much more sense when you look. It's like the skeleton key to understanding everything. And, both liberals and conservatives, right, both left neoliberals and right neoliberals have this idealist concept of where these problems come from, whether it's because, black people are morally depraved and prone to fatherlessness
or Appalachians, hillbilly elegy.
or Appalachians on the one hand, or on the other hand, white people are racist and that's a failure of their morality. Whereas, leftists would always go back to the underlying material basis for this.
And I think, what is often missed in, the divide that is, a very real one between liberals and leftists, is... It does make me laugh in a certain way. Like, I think when you point out the idealism of liberals, and it's always liberals who are looking at socialists and anarchists being like, you wacky people, you're so
you
crazy.
Utopians.
Whereas, their deeply semi-religious faith, and I think this is what you're talking about, in institutions as the upholders of a moral state of affairs.
Which is why Trump can have a hashtag resistance that's not only Democrats, but also many Republicans, right? Because those institutions are something that they care a lot about.
And they truly believe that, a liberal democracy upheld by faith in these institutions will, if it were done best, it were better, would, deliver us into the state of equality and harmony that we all in some ways want, and it's historic too. And I think Sean, your input about the history of these things is always necessary, because part of it is to do with this Enlightenment delusion that the state formed by a kind of
social compact.
Yeah, and you even see leftists who aren't thinking about it when they're writing it talk about this populism and the austerity measures also ripping apart the social contract. And it's like, Nietzsche even called the social contractualism a sort of liberal myth, a very ideological myth, because the state was always formed through a sort of violent grabbing of power and a violent assertion of power. It was never, certainly a violent one. There was never this agreement with state powers and a populace that was this gesture towards harmony, and that was the like raison d'etat. The raison d'etat was never that. So I think that's why liberals get stuck, and they're sort of like, you know, so baffled and so unsure of what to do with themselves post Trump's election, because, you know, they just presume, like, you know, but what about the social contract? Where did that go? And, like, you know, whether it ever may.
Like, where do they think that private property came from in the first place?
So I think
like on the private property thing, one thing that really popped out of my mind, Tash, when you were talking about how they view these institutions and how they view the government. If only government were free of corruption, if only we could tweak things in this technocratic way, you know, it's the self-governing mechanism of liberal institutions. That's exactly the same way they look at markets, right? And I don't want to make too strong a point, but I don't think it's an accident actually that they feel that way about both of those things in this particular era. I think that, again, one of the things that separates liberals from leftists is that we understand that these things are not self-governing, that not only is capitalism prone to crisis, as we've seen over and over again, but the state is prone to crisis, right? The state is this violent entity, and the state has within it basically the seeds of its own destructions in many cases. We have the longest running constitutional government in world history right now, but that doesn't say that 10 years down the line we couldn't fall back into something different, probably worse, but maybe better. I don't know.
Yeah,
but I do think that actually I was at Theorizing the Web, which is like a fun yearly conference in New York, which does what it says on the label, theorizes the web. Brilliant writer and editor Maya Binyam in a panel made the point that liberal and mainstream media likes to point out both the like stupidity and like the violent rhetoric of Trump and his administration, and the kind of loving to point out his mistakes in tweets and typos and things like that. And it's like
misunderestimating him.
And this idea, even if you're estimating him correctly, what is the tacit?
It was a George W. Bush joke.
Oh, misunderestimating. Which, yeah, also like this is nothing new. And, you know, Foucault talked about the fact of like absurdity and buffoonery never being a kind of contradiction to state control. Like, you know, we've got a long history of like buffoons in power that's never been. But
why do fascists use violence? It's because they're too stupid to rule in any other way, right?
And also, you know, Maya's point I think was a good one, which she was like, well, what would these liberals prefer? Like a more efficient state?
Yes.
Like, it's not to say, oh, yay for these buffoons, and then, you know, that the buffoons are part of their own collapse. They're not. Power is completely maintainable and as pernicious when, you know, organized by a certain absurd buffoonery. But the pointing out of that as the problem suggests this weird desire, this institutional desire, that things run smoothly. And I'm like, that wouldn't be my response to when I see and laugh and, like, joke about Trump not being able to spell, including his wife's own name.
Really?
He sent a tweet this. I know it's so lame to like talk about Trump tweets, but this is actually funny. He was like, because Melania was ill, right, or had something, and she went back home to the White House, and he tweeted like, "It's so good to have Melanie home."
Oh my god!
Like, hashtag free Melanie, Melanie.
Wow. I mean, we can walk and chew gum here at the Antifada. It's possible to laugh at Trump's buffoonery at the same time that we have a clear-eyed historical materialist analysis of where he comes from. So. This is an idea I've been kicking around, and you guys can feel free to shoot it down or cut it out if it is bad.
Consider it shot down.
No,
go ahead.
So I feel like the far right also has a critique of neoliberalism as well as a somewhat materialist analysis of where the world is going. They're just somewhat more pessimistic and dark and tribalist in their view of human nature, and they're also on the other side of things. Right. Whereas leftists want everyone to cooperate in order to survive in this coming ecological and financial catastrophe that we see on the horizon. They have a more exterminist view of how we're going to organize ourselves. Whereas liberals might have a more Pollyanna-ish outlook by saying, maybe we can, maybe we can't see the writing on the wall, but all we need is like more entrepreneurship and more people to take like individual actions to pull themselves up, and everything's going to be fine. We just need a few little tweaks and the system is going to function just like it always has. Whereas, people on the far left and the far right, both, they seem kind of crazy to people who aren't really paying attention to this stuff, but like we both see this coming catastrophic state of affairs that's going to happen, and it's already happening and upending the current world order of things. And in a way, they have a materialist analysis too. They're getting people ready for what they think the outcome should be, which is, exterminate large portions of the population, deport them, whatever you have to do, and keep this shrinking pie. Keep it for the right people, right? The Europeans, the Anglo-Saxons, the people who they believe are the natural inheritors and rulers of this world. So, it goes back to a lot of conversations we've had on Majority Report in the recent past, too, where, talking about where the right wing is coming from and where all of these Trump people are coming from. And basically, they see a shrinking pie, and they see women and minorities and historically marginalized groups getting higher proportions of the pie than they used to. And their reaction is a protective one, saying, no, we're going to fight back against this because the pie is shrinking and that's how it's going to be. Whereas I think people on the left might say, oh, the pie is shrinking, but it doesn't have to be that way. I
agree with you, but I guess my question is there materialism, you're saying some sort of biological racial determinism? Because I think that the concept of IQ science and the Aryan race and things of that sort seems like it's grounded in some sort of naturalism.
That stuff is bullshit.
It's idealist because it's just not true.
Yeah, that stuff is all part of their ideology that they're building, this ideological framework to justify what they believe is going to happen in the coming years.
They talk about resources and who should be able to access resources in this idea of homeland and who has a right to there is a sort of material relationality to land and the idea of home, which
blood
is,
and soil.
As you were saying, this idea that marginalized communities, people of color, women, and then queers would be taking those resources doesn't pay attention to actually material history about the consolidation of wealth into fewer hands.
I think maybe what I'm getting for what you said, Babe, is that they do see things not necessarily from a historical materialist analysis, but one that's very grounded in the material world of resources and who's going to get them. Is that the sense you meant it in?
Yeah, the sense that it's a zero-sum game, and they want to be the winners of this zero-sum game based on these really pseudo-scientific affiliations, but ones that have resonance with a lot of folks nonetheless. Whereas I think there's this idea on the part of both the center-right and center-left, I think, that capitalism can provide an infinite amount of prosperity for everyone, and nobody has to be a loser if only we play our cards right and have the right technocratic policy.
Fascism was historically a reaction towards communism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when they develop a argument that there's dwindling resources and we have to close the borders and shoot anybody trying to cross them, which is, definitely their vision future. It's not a realistic response to what's going on with the economy or with resources. It's a way of creating an us and them and borders, whether they be national or within the nation. And it's more about the creation of myth than actually responding to material questions.
Well, I guess I'm wrong then.
I think you're totally correct in the sense that it came out of socialism, but it's just a reaction. It's not genuine.
It's what's the term? It's Herrenvolk social democracy, right? They want to have Spencer wants to have a whites only welfare state.
Yeah, and we see that in a lot of far right parties in Europe too. Even Trump has made some rhetorical feints in that direction, even if he has no intention of actually carrying it out.
Le Pen and the National Front in France is way more supportive of the gains made by working class French people than Macron is. It's just they want it for only whites and they want to kick all the Arabs out.
In many ways, they ran against austerity just for certain groups of people.
Well, it's the same, the AfD with the language of Heimat, it means home in German, but
and you're talking about Alternative for Deutschland?
AfD is Alternative for Deutschland, which is the far-right party in Germany that did sort of remarkably well in the last election and is gaining more and more purchase, largely, and certainly rhetorically, in reaction to the amount of refugees that came into the country in the past 3 years, and that being able to, as we're seeing in our own country, to kind of position them as a threat and an enemy through that, using a language of homeland and who has and should have access. And then there is a reliance on are talking about resources. But again, based on its own mythology of who's home and where. So there's a sort of very like ideological, mythic aspect to this kind of rhetoric.
So to kind of round out this discussion on violence, in the general sense, the real world and in terms of ideas and how we understand them, I wanted to talk about how the left relates to violence, somewhat historically, but more about how we here in the room think that revolutionary violence, were it to happen, is inevitable, or whether it's something that should be avoided, what our stance should be on that. And as a way to segue into that, I think that structural violence is oftentimes invisible. You can go to a library and you can pick up a book called The Black Book of Communism, which is a piece of propaganda, but with some true facts in it, right? Talking about the purges of Stalin and the Gulag system, talking about the famine in Ukraine, which they call the Holodomor, which is a little ideological, but a lot of people obviously starved during primitive socialist accumulation.
Yeah, people love to bring it up right now about how people are eating rats in Venezuela.
Yeah. I mean, certainly Marx himself caused, I think they say, 1.7 billion deaths. And so communism is a dead ideology. I mean, we've all heard this stuff, right? But, before we get into like the left and violence, I want to talk about, again, the structural violence that we've seen historically. And there are a lot of examples. One great one I could bring up would be the Bengal famine, which happened in then India, which is now part of Pakistan, where I think between 3.5 and 4 million Bengalis died of a completely preventable famine because Churchill refused to give them aid. In fact, he said, "I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion."
Jesus.
And then he said, "Why should we provide any food aid for these people when they're just going to breed like rabbits?"
So, by the way, considered and voted the greatest Briton.
Oh, yeah. And we love him here in the United States, too. He's like some sort of hero here. And actually, it's funny, too. You talked about Gandhi earlier. When Churchill first heard about the famine, and this is happening in 43 during the Second World War, the first thing he asked is, did that fakir Gandhi die yet of the famine? Because if not, I don't want to hear about it.
God.
Because they had already started the independence movement. But, that right there is a crime of 4 million dead, which, matches probably a lot of what happened in Ukraine and in China during the Great Leap Forward. But I think maybe the most glaring example of this sort of what we would not call violence, I think, ideologically, but which caused the death of a lot of people, was the Irish potato famine. Mm-hmm. And people, this because you're British, and somehow Britain ended up entwined with Ireland. I forget how. Maybe they just decided to be friends or whatever.
Just in trouble.
So the history of the Irish potato famine is not merely of a blight that destroys the potatoes and all these poor Irish people die because of natural circumstances. To make a very long story short, you had basically the imposition of market-driven agriculture within Ireland, because in order to keep a really cheap labor source for the landlords over there, who were getting a lot of money from all sorts of things like wool and agriculture and livestock in general, and some small manufacturing, if you had a whole bunch of people who were eating the cheapest thing and the easiest thing to produce there, which was one type of potato, you had a very cheap source of labor, right? And basically, this is pushed upon the Irish people so that they're almost solely relying on potatoes with a little subsistence agriculture in the mid-19th century. Now, what happens is a blight comes from the New World, and this blight is a fungus which destroys pretty much the entire potato crop of Ireland, what people are, primarily subsisting off of. And this is where capitalism ties in, because in previous famines, which happened during that period of time, the potato wasn't dominant, so people had other things to eat, and also the government stopped the export of all these agricultural goods because the people in Ireland needed them to survive. What happens in 1845 and 46 and 47, 48 with this Irish potato famine is a new idea and a new politics arose, which is laissez-faire. So as opposed to other crises that happened, Lord John Russell, who was a Whig, was in charge of the policy there. He basically said that the market will fix this problem. He said that we need to use laissez-faire economics in order to solve this crisis. And so the Irish need to keep exporting food, even as less and less food was available for these people. So for that reason, essentially, these people are dying of food, and they're still sending a bunch of their food off to England and the rest of the world. And this laissez-faire ideology, which was implemented by Great Britain, led to the death of, they estimate, about 800,000 Irish people, and the emigration of 1.5 to 2 million people, Irish people across the world. Out of a population of 8 million, that's 3 million people about affected by this. And that's not seen as violence. That's seen as something that's natural.
And the birth
it just happened.
Not to mention the birth of about 1 million future cops, shall we say.
And Red Sox fans.
Yeah, no, and it's not taught as violent, though, right? Like, it's not, like in England going to school, like they gloss over colonialism. And certainly when you talk about the Irish Troubles, this is learnt as, a process, not a structurally imposed set of things that led to a sort of genocidal wiping out of an oppressed population.
So where I would like to go with this, and this is for Andy, this is for Natasha, and whatever my wife's name, I forget what it was, Jamie. That's an invisible violence, right? But then the violence of Stalin and the gulags, or Pol Pot, for example, is made very visible, right, in our history as this political, as the inevitability of what left politics will bring you to. Even Jordan Peterson will say that trans rights is the equivalent of a Maoist cultural revolution that's going to destroy millions of lives.
How would he react to a real Marxist? I just want to know.
He'd slap him silly.
Yeah, I'm sure he would.
Bucko. So what I wanted to ask is, what's our vision of revolutionary violence, or what violence is acceptable on the left? I will start out by saying that lone wolf terrorism and bombing of civilians, like we've seen in a lot of cases, is absolutely fucking abhorrent, and I will never find that to be an acceptable form of violence. But let's sort of think about the uses of violence in the past and today.
So I think it's complicated, right? And I have a distaste because I think it's dumb. Not dumb as a thing to do, a dumb as a thing to believe in, when you have sort of insurrectionary leftists talking about, building a military in the woods. And like, have you seen what you're up against? And maybe that's just, a shame. But I also don't like it.
Well, the protracted People's War could start in Appalachia, then spread to the Ozarks, take the Mass Line.
And,
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. You pick up your few rifles and, like you start talking to the 30,000 soldiers of the NYPD. So, and that speaks to what we're up against, but it also speaks to having better tacticians and talking about infrastructure and control and how, and if I knew, then I would be, playing a probably very different role in my life and society. I have no idea. Obviously, what gets called and decried and criminalized as violence, like, certain types of property damage. I think we also have to be careful when we talk about property damage and violence, because often we're not careful enough. So we'll be like, property damage isn't violence. And I would say most of the things that are criminalized as property damage, bank windows getting broken, what happens in a riot, I don't want to call that violence. But of course there can be violence against inanimate objects because different victims are created. So, if a neo-Nazi desecrates a Jewish grave, that is a violence. Like, it creates a different victim. So I think whenever we talk about violence, we have to make sure we finish our sentences, like, against whom, by what, for what, who are, like, what is a victim? And I think that stops us, or at least should catch us from making glossed and overly broad proclamations, which I'm not interested in doing. And, quite often I'm more interested in destabilizing and pointing out misframings. So, I don't know. I think I agree with you, Sean, about, like, the sort of tactics I would never advocate for. And, anything sort of individualized like that, it seems like, what is where would that go? What sort of thing are we trying to reproduce in the world?
As a wise person once said, I'm not sure whose quote this is, you cannot bomb a social relation.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a real debate on the left as to what constitutes acceptable violence and what is an appropriate response to the violence of the status quo and the violence of capitalism. And I think all of us here in this room agree that capitalism needs to end if we're going to organize society around human needs.
Not Andy.
Rather than...
You just told me before the show.
Oh, yeah? He's a real cipher, that one. And I was raised to be a nonviolent person. My parents are hippies, and I have sort of a visceral revulsion towards violence. But I also realize that if we're going to end capitalism, there might need to be violence at some point in time. So I don't romanticize it. In fact, I think it's really scary, and it's a major tension in my own politics. At the same time, I don't think we should rule it out because like Marx said, it's not up to me to write recipes for the cook shops of the future. And whatever happens has to be very much contingent on the political and material circumstances of the time and the place in which it's happening. So I really don't have a great answer to that question quite yet.
But what we can talk about now is something that isn't futurally projecting and isn't about how we do a vast structural rupture. We can talk about like what to do about organizing fascists, and that's a big question that's coming up about like violence, punching Richard Spencer, which I did take like visceral joy in.
Oh, I think we all.
But we've got a really problematic baseline now when you can punch Identity Europa, you can punch Richard Spencer, and then you always get this question of where's the line? Where is your line?
Slippery slope.
What is your target? Are you? And I think one of the problems there is that it's a hypothetical that it works as a hypothetical, but it's never really a practical question. Like, we don't have lots of Antifa participants rounding up basic like college Republicans who aren't also attending, a Milo Yiannopoulos talk and who aren't also going to the Unite the Right rally and getting like beaten up. That's it's not happening. So I don't think we're even anywhere close to having to really talk about this gray area of targets. But I've written about this before, and I think a lot of concepts we don't actually have clear delineations of when they end, right? We don't know, Wittgenstein's whole argument about like a game, like he couldn't give you a definition of the term game now that you would know in perpetuity would always describe what a game is. Does it always have players? No, because of individual games. Does it always have winners? No, because you have a draw. This is the family resemblance concept. It's a Venn diagram of things, but it's potentially got no limit. But yet we confidently use the word game, and it's never bothered us before. But yet when you talk about who gets to be a punchable fascist, I can't give you the limit, but we use the word game, and it doesn't bother us. It's about practice and habit that we learn to kind of consider a target or not.
Maybe punching Nazis is like the definition that the Supreme Court gave of pornography. You can't define it, but you know it when you see it.
Right, and I think
maybe know when the Nazi can be punched, in that moment.
And I think it's also like it's not, because the problem with that definition is it's not that it was a problematic definition per se. It's who gets to see it and who gets to decide is the problem with the Supreme Court decision about that and obscenity. Sure. But if we're saying about targets and targets of violence here, it's not just an authority and a power that gets to decide that, and a kind of puncher in chief. What we would be advocating for is communal process such that we know it, we choose it, not I choose it.
Yeah, that's another point I was going to make. The difference between sort of satisfying interpersonal violence versus something more systemic, and it reminds me of that article that our friend Jared wrote about how he punched his boss in the face.
Great article on Vice, yeah.
Yeah, it was called, I think, I Punched My Boss in the Face.
That was also my boss. I know the boss that he punched in the face.
Oh, wow. Yeah, nice. I knew that. So, like,
I didn't punch
but the conclusion that he came to in the end was, he had an excuse to be in Vice. He had a punchy headline. Well, but in the end, he said, it felt great to punch my boss in the face, but I also realized that doesn't change anything about the system and about the power relations that exist here. So whether or not we are using violence, I think the yardstick that we should use is this going to create some sort of systemic change or not? And I think there is an argument to be made that all of these, much maligned Antifa protests actually played a pretty big role in suppressing the alt-right and denying them a platform.
Yeah,
sure.
and draining them of real material resources, right?
Yeah, and then historically that's been true, and it's funny how things play out over time, right? After, when service, at the end of the Second World War, back in England, you had all these service members coming back, a number of whom were Jewish. And you had Jewish service members coming back to England and seeing this, thinking that, they'd defeated fascism, the Nazis were gone. And they were coming back and there was a huge amount of fascist organizing. And Jewish service members seeing this, and they organized into fighting brigades, the 43 group. Their phrase was like, maim, not kill. And they beat the absolute shit out of Oswald Mosley's fascists as they organized.
The black shirts.
And they were very much, given the credit of beating back post-war rising fascism. And now, in sort of fable and history, the 43 group is super praised. Vidal Sassoon, the hairdresser, he was one of them. Like, the word didn't exist now, but these were like vigorous and ferocious Antifa tactics.
Yeah.
And
sorry, Trevor Noah.
and we're talking about a very sort of reactive, in our case on the left, sort of violence against, relatively small but obviously frightening growth of the quote-unquote alt-right or these neo-fascists in the United States. Just imagine the sort of upheaval. I won't even say violence, but imagine the amount of social and political and cultural upheaval that would be necessary in order to eliminate capitalism and everything that comes from it, from this world. That's, I think, the ultimate huge question that faces us, is that if, we're squeamish about whether Richard Spencer could get punched in the face and that's okay or not, how do we even imagine what sort of actions would be necessary in order for the vast majority of the people in this world to actually seize what's theirs? Again, I'm like you, Tash. I certainly am not a pacifist. On the other hand, though, when I see these like Marxist-Leninists or these Maoists or even insurrectionary anarchists who uphold violence as this like wonderful revolutionary principle, they make these gulag jokes, but they're probably serious. They probably would gulag and execute people, right? That scares the shit out of me just as much as like the person who wants to sit on their hands while Mosley and the fascists, march through a Jewish neighborhood.
Yeah. As folks on the more anarcho end of the spectrum, I think most of us would rather not sit in a gulag for the rest of our lives after the tankies come to power. Still, like, a lot of the tactics that I personally subscribe to and would participate in fall under the category of nonviolent direct action, right? Political education, mutual aid, spreading awareness, general strikes, financial sabotage, things of that nature. But I also acknowledge that if these struggles were ever to pick up steam and become a real threat, I mean, we've seen it in the past. The state is not going to give up power willingly, and they're probably going to respond with violence. And that is an eventuality that is still very hard for me to even think about.
No, and it's true, but like I think we have to be realistic that we're not going to be ready in terms of armed violence to be a counter. So it's about being like strategical, if that, yes, I do believe the state has never been afraid to step in and, talking of general strikes, the state has never been afraid to react violently to that, to talk about, any riotous activity. The state has never been afraid to react with the most extreme violence possible. But it's just wildly impractical for an organizing left to say, okay, no, we'll be ready for that because it's like,
right,
it's not like,
yeah.
Unfortunately, there is such an imbalance now that is just wildly impractical.
And if you look at things historically, successful revolutions in the past, the Bolshevik Revolution, so-called, was relatively bloodless. As Lenin famously says, power was in the street and we picked it up. And obviously that was because of the force of the Soviets. But it was basically because the military in the Second World War under the Tsar and then the Constituent Assembly was an empty shell, and soldiers were defecting. And a form of counterpower in the workers' councils came up, and it just took the political will in order to go to the Winter Palace and arrest everybody, right? Where the violence comes is in the counter-revolution, right, which is the Civil War.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
And then I would argue, too, that the next counter-revolution, which is the rise of Stalin, liquidating basically all the old communists and then many, many other political enemies and instituting what we call Stalinism. So, yeah, a revolution happens, and it could be like the Carnation Revolution was relatively bloodless. And in all these cases, it seems like you need defections from those elements in the state that are able to inflict violence and have the legitimate right to inflict violence, like the police or the military. They refused, or they came to the side of people in struggle trying to fight against the old system. So, the idea that we're going to, again, like Natasha was saying and Jamie, you were saying, that we're going to have equal arms, we're going to have Osprey helicopters and 50 cals on helicopters fighting. It's just absurd. I haven't got my tank from Soros yet, but I'm waiting.
Even in a situation where a revolution is happening, as we've seen in the history of, say, the Russian Revolution, the majority of this work is political work. And that is something that we can do without any violence at all.
That's right. Until the state gets scared enough of us that they start throwing us in jail and shooting us. But
so I think I'd like to end this on a more positive note, if I may. I really liked your interview about love with Maura Weigel in the Times. I liked that piece very much.
It was called The Revolutionary Love of Bashing a Fascist Face Open, right? Oh, no, that was a different one. Sorry.
Yeah, I think so. And you talk a lot about some things that we've talked about on this show quite a bit already. Social reproduction, heteromonogamy as an oppressive force, but love as also a potentially revolutionary force. You go over how different feminist thinkers have thought about love through the years, whether it was Sylvia Federici, who thought that this sort of heterosexual marriage was always going to be an oppressive unit. You talk about bell hooks, who I really like a lot, talking about how love is a verb and a potentially creative or resistance-laden force in the world. I would also bring in some Bolshevik thinkers like Kollontai, who believed that this new kind of love should take over, and our love for each other in society would supersede our love for any kind of romantic partners or children or family units, and the family would sort of wither away as this bourgeois way of organizing things. And personally, I have felt a little bit resistant to that idea when I'm reading this stuff, because that's not how my life is structured. You know, I have a partner, and
Who dat?
who I love very much.
Aw,
and I
thanks.
really
I
feel
love you too.
like, you know, it's us against the world. But then again, if the world weren't so terrible, maybe that wouldn't be such a dilemma for me. And I know you have a partner as well, who you presumably love very much as well.
Yeah, I do.
And-
Shout out to Lucas.
Oh, tell him you love him for the first time on air.
Lucas, let's get married.
Oh, you heard it here first,
That's a
folks.
first on Antifada, a marriage proposal.
So like, how do you navigate these ideas in your own life, and what do you do with that?
I mean, I think it's really complicated, and I think, you know, so when Moira and I were talking about it, one thing that was central was to note that idea of love as object has obviously, sometimes it gets spoken about it as if it's like transcendental, unchanging object over history, whereas, you know, her work has looked at the fact of dating and courtship has obviously changed a lot over history and has, you know, always reflected certain sorts of economic relations, you know, a lot of the idea of going steady, that very phrase came about during post-war full employment, and now you've got kind of more precarious, different modes of, you know, dating in a more precarious economy. And she's not saying they're like directly causal, but like we have to think about the way in which courtship, not necessarily love, but that which is called this love object, has shifted over history, of course, and it has to do with economic relations. There's also, you know, as you point out, Jamie, this revolutionary discourse of love and, you know, a recognition that a vector for capitalism and reproduction of ourselves through the family form has sort of been an object of critique for the left. And, you know, how do we smash the family, smash heteropatriarchal normativity? And I think sometimes that gets taken into a direction that is really thoughtless. In terms of, you know, the only radical, the only liberatory thing to do is fuck everything, no partners, full.
I know some friends like that.
And you know what, I do too, and actually I've had partners like that, and it ended up performing a really sort of violent oppression. And like, I'm aware that our desires are formed by the society that we're in, so could be reorganized differently, but that's not done by suddenly like jumping into desirous spaces you don't actually want. And sometimes I think people talk about being post-heteronormative in a way that's so absurd. Like if someone says they're post-racial, right, they're fucking racist.
Right.
And I think sometimes when people are like, well, I'm post-gender, it's like, no, I'm still very fucking situated in this world. I can challenge it and think about it and, you know, think about challenging our monogamies and our ideas of trust. But I'm not going to be like, yeah, fuck that noise, I'm over it, I'm so liberated. And to be fair, if we think about like societal organizations and how they are performed through techno-capital, like this kind of anarcho chat about free love, you know, again existed in the very patriarchal 60s free love movement, even though that same movement, you know, did have, you know, important, crucial strides towards feminist liberation. You also have, you know, people at the fucking Playa at Burning Man and people in, you know, penthouse apartments in Soho swiping through their Thrinder to have their, you know, massive orgy sex parties. So, you know, that hasn't changed the social relations just because you're having an orgy in your, you know, your
Yeah.
And Natasha found out about our Soho penthouse. I guess the party's off. Cancel the party.
I'd
Sorry,
like to
everybody.
clarify.
No, come, but-
Kollontai. Oh my god. Yeah, totally. Kollontai wasn't talking about anonymous sex either. She had this idea of like winged eros, where sex would be used to form these social bonds of revolutionary
Sure,
love.
But I think, people, even if it's not anonymous, this idea of like having this revolutionary idea of using your body for that sort of intimacy to create, I'm like, sure, feasibly, but this idea that it is necessary. I think that's what happens a lot with like revolutionary chat about sex and love, is it's this sort of requirement to be leftist enough or rad enough, but like to have certain, but what an absurd thing of saying like certain types of bodily connection.
Oh yeah, or the revolutionary love could be platonic as well. I
Exactly,
think
like,
she
I don't-
defines it in a bunch of open-ended ways.
Right, and I think it's that kind of confusion, like love. Yes, of course, I think like there should be many forms of love. I'm bored of rad leftists telling other leftists that they should fuck everyone and that we all have to fuck each other, because I don't think we do, and also I don't. And if people want to, fine, but I don't think that sort of like.
There's nothing inherently political, is what you're saying
Yeah.
about that?
And-
It's almost like the things we do as individuals in the culture don't actually do much to change the underlying structure of
I don't-
society.
Yeah, and I don't think,
Word.
and I do think, obviously, there are hierarchies that are, very, really violent, that organize our desires, and the way that works around differently abled bodies and queer bodies and trans bodies, and it's not fair and it's wrong, or like slim or chubby, and it's not fair. But I'm not going to. I
think it's actually thick now, not chubby anymore.
Yeah,
That's
that
what
is the
kids are saying.
politically correct term for it.
two C's, thick with two C's,
Yep.
thick bodies.
We'll put that in the jargon notes.
But I don't, I don't think, therefore, the liberatory thing to do is then police your own desires out of like doing what you want and like not having a partner that you want, or like, and your guys' wedding was this beautiful, joyful thing, and I don't want a world where that is, eradicated as counter-revolutionary. I think it's boring to live that way, and I think it's unfun. And I think, I don't think that's what Bell Hooks was talking about when she was talking about the redemptive possibilities of love.
I don't want to get too sentimental because we don't really do that on the Antifada. But when Jamie and I were first together many years back, sorry, you're not that old, babe. Don't worry. But some years back, I was still caught up, I think, in some of what you're talking about, Tash. This sense that bourgeois marriage is this archaic institution of oppression that needs to be destroyed, and I'll never get married. And Jamie and I and a bunch of our friends were actually in New Orleans. We were staying in this awesome house at this, having a really good time, and we were all drunk. It was like we were day drinking because it's New Orleans, and that's just what you do. And somebody mentioned something about marriage, and Jamie was in the kitchen. I
No,
was
our
in the living
friend
room.
who was from Australia and New Zealand was saying she needs to find someone to have a green card marriage with so she can stay in the country.
Ooh, maybe you should tell the story.
And Sean here, kindly enough, offered to marry her.
I'm charitable.
And
It's an important thing to do.
he had
sometimes.
just met her.
No nations, no borders. Fuck law and order.
Yes, fair enough. But he had just met her a few days prior, and I was like, what about me? And he was like, no, I don't believe in that. We're not getting married. And like, we were having this conversation for the first time.
In front of, like, 10 people.
All my
Oof.
friends on vacation in New Orleans. And it was a lot for me.
And Jamie kind of lost it, and I felt really bad. I was being, I don't know, as I purposefully sometimes do, being a little provocative after I've had a couple of drinks. And, as it turns out, many years later, I decided that for all the faults of, the legalized partnership under capitalism that is marriage, and there are many, many faults to that, if I was going to do it, it might as well be with the most lovely, amazing, smart, brilliant, sweet person I've ever met, and that I'm willing to put up with all the shackles and violent chains of bourgeois marriage in order to, I don't know, be around Jamie Peck some more.
Aw, I don't know whether to cry or throw up right
You
now.
guys do this
Both.
kind of shit every show.
I love parties. I love celebrating
Parties are
love.
good.
And then I know people that are like, yeah. So we'll do a wedding, but we won't involve the state. We won't.
Yeah, I've seen that before.
But then I'm also like, guys, don't be dumb. Tax benefits, like especially if one of you is foreign, like don't be dumb. Like if you're doing the performance of that like celebrating love, but also entering into like what is an archaic heterotypical relation.
Economical.
Like don't don't not get your tax benefits. Like,
Yeah.
and so
There's a reason that coercive state power works.
and, also,
And I'm pretty sure
insurance and-
that my union provides.
I mean, yeah, my presence on this show, as well as the Majority Report, is completely subsidized by Sean's union health insurance.
And I think
Which we wouldn't get without bourgeois marriage.
and I do think, all of which is to speak to the fact that whilst we're organizing and creating networks and loving each other and creating ideas and imaginaries for better politics, we also have to navigate. And we have to navigate the now and find joy in it too, which isn't the same thing as being like a class traitor or a rev traitor. And so, yeah, I mean...
Gender traitor.
A gender traitor.
As
So-
if same-sex
Handmaid's Tale
relationships are not also polluted by patriarchal dynamics in society.
Right, I'm sorry. I guess I've lived through in what 9 years of being in New York and being in the anarchist scene for much of it. Like I've seen too much radical posturing to bother with that. Which isn't to say that's giving up on new forms of relationality, but I definitely think navigation and care and a little bit of doing what you want.
Yeah, word. We're all fans of doing what you want here at the Antifada and not overthink. I mean, it's possible to drive yourself crazy, and I, often have overthinking these things, like, the family unit, the nuclear family, having kids, social reproduction, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are done in service of capital. And in that way, refusing to do it or refusing to have kids or whatever can be a form of resistance, should you choose to do so. But, I mean, if you take that a little bit farther, everything we do to keep ourselves alive is also a form of social reproduction and is also done in service of capital. And I can only speak for myself here, but I like being alive. I like living my life, generally speaking. It has its ups and downs. So,
So you love capitalism.
I'm not
Ergo.
gonna have kids or feed myself just to own the capitalist class.
like you
Take
could,
that, capital.
we could all just kill ourselves, and that
Woo!
there
Let's do it.
is a movement. It's called Sad Girl. What's it called? It's called like the Sad Girl something in art, and a lot of it is about like passiveness, self-harm, just kind of lying down and dying as a form of resistance to capitalist patriarchy. And I'm sorry, but that sounds terrible to me.
Go punch a
Like,
Nazi in the
Exactly,
face
do
instead,
something more
please.
useful with
like
your
what?
body.
Like I get it. Like I'm not going to tell you what to do with your body, but it's not ever going to be enough for me. So as we move through our lives in this capitalist hell world and think about how best we can resist, it's impossible to live a life that is not in service of capital in some way, whether or not you get married, whether or not you have kids. So given those facts, like, yeah, it does drive me crazy that the things I do in my life, whether it's with my partner who I love, with my friends, with my job, which I also like, all of this is on some level exploitative. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do what you want to do with your life. And like, furthermore, I think a point that I was trying to make in a lot of our wedding vows, a lot of the vows that I wrote, as well as what our awesome friend Kenton said in his ceremony, his wonderful ceremony where he called our love praxis. I thought that was fucking cool as hell and probably inspired by bell hooks on some level, because Kenton's a smart cookie. I think there is a way, like I agree with Weigel, there is a way for love, whether it's romantic love or friend love or civic comradely love, for it to be a site of struggle and a mode of resistance, even as it is necessarily tied up in this whole system that we're all caught up in. I think it's got that revolutionary potential. And in addition to, because it feels good, that's a fucking great reason to keep on doing it.
So as we said many, many years back, when we were involved in occupations and other forms of bullshit, awesome juvenile insurrectionary shit, to the Soho Loft, to the Fuckfest, onwards and upwards, comrades, to a future horizon of freedom and lots of hot sex.
Hell yeah. And P.S., that would be our forthcoming $100 patron reward, is you get an invitation to the Soho Loft Fuckfest.
I did not agree to that.
$250. Oh, yeah?
Yeah, don't sell yourself short.
No, we're a proletarian podcast, We got to make
We'll
it
do
affordable.
sliding scale.